Hello and welcome to Unplugged, an IoT podcast where we dive into the fascinating world of industrial Internet of Things and automation. I'm your host, Phil Savoa.
G'day, Phil, and hi, everyone. My name's Ed Fuentes. Well, Phil, we've had some really interesting guests over time, people working in integrators, vendors, software solution providers. And today we're quite honored actually having someone from Cisco, a well-known brand that you and I are familiar with. And especially as we play into this space of IoT and that idea of IT and OT, that bridging that gap scenario. So we're very happy to have someone who's probably industrial IoT architecture focused with secure network designing, Kevin Wood, who's from Cisco. So, Kevin, thank you very much today for joining us on this podcast.
Thank you for having me, for sure.
And before we dive into this week's topic, this week's episode is made possible by Phoenix Contact for Industry 4 transformation. PLCnext is your open modular accelerator. It combines IEC 61131 PLC logic and high-level languages like C++, Simulink, and Python in parallel tasks. Adds applications from PLCnext store and plug into your global digital ecosystem with scalable, connected, intelligent automation. So thank you, PLCnext Technology, for supporting us and making this possible.
And I've got one right behind me here too, Phil. So for those who want to know, PLC Next is pretty prominent on my shelf.
Absolutely. So Kevin, you've been in the IoT space now as a chief global architect for Cisco. Um, you know, Maybe you can help us set the scene of IoT on the plant floor and give us maybe some of your firsthand, experience on, different industry approaches for IoT from your perspective.
Yeah, so I guess first of all, we have to think about some of the challenges that we hit in the environment. So we started talking about manufacturing. You think about IT and OT and how they view each other so differently. And the first problem is that they often don't understand each other. And I think the number one issue there is the lack of collaboration. And we've had I've seen a lot of contentious relationships between IT and OT, but it always boils down to collaboration. So IT doesn't understand what OT does. OT doesn't understand what IT is trying to do, right? So that is always, and I always like to joke, and that's my Dr. Phil or my psychiatric moment who we have between the teams. When in all actuality, they're all just trying to help each other and help the organization. But without having that collaboration in place, what does OT think? Their job is to keep things up and running. They immediately think that they're being overwhelmed by a technical stack that's going to take the environment down. IT is going to say that, OT is, wild, wild west, right? They're, slinging technology at it without any concern for security, to the point where I think IT tends to put a wall around OT, right? So, and it's the whole notion of if what I can't see, I'm just going to put a wall around it. And I like to use the analogy of a castle where we dig a moat and put razor wire around it. And we're just trying and hoping that nothing gets in or nothing gets out. While that probably worked in the past, as we go into Industry 4.0, it's all about connectivity. It's all about bringing these two environments together. And it's definitely, as we start looking at the AI world, we have to connect these worlds together. So I like to think of it as a black box historically. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to shine a light into the OT space. So the C-suite, i.e. the CISO and everything, they have total visibility of what's trying to get in and what's trying to get out of that OT space.
In that time, then, Kevin, have you seen it improve, and why has it improved, if it has?
It has improved, but it's not for a lack of struggle. And I think it's a lot of perception that OT had a tendency to, if they saw IT as a blocker, and everybody tends to think that security is a disabler. I think it's an enabler, right? Because if you don't have the appropriate security in place, you can't think, you can't fail fast. You can't do the innovative things that you want to do. You can't turn products quicker. So I think it's some of the realization. And then unfortunately, some of this has been the school of hard knocks with security breaches. Some have experienced the malware attacks or the breaches just because of the manufacturing space is probably, if not the number one of the largest targeted spaces. And why? Because some of the technology on the manufacturing floor is really, really old. And we'll see operating systems all the way back to XP and others, NT, things that can't be patched, but the machine operators haven't upgraded those platforms. So when you're a manufacturer, you're kind of stuck in this catch-22. I can't upgrade them. So what do? I have to start thinking of compensating controls, or it's the head in the sand moment. I do nothing until there's a breach. So I think some of the view on security has forced that communication to become better, but don't be fooled for a minute that we don't go every day and have this conversation, that there's always this, you know, IT said, well, I mean, OT said, if IT's not going to do it, I'll just go out and buy my own internet connection, or I'll work with this vendor, drop it on the wire. And if we don't have visibility into those environments, it just happens, right? And now we've got a security vulnerability out there. If I have a good visibility solution in place, then I'm aware of it and I can be alerted to it and I can put the appropriate controls around it.
Yeah,
But this
the visibility on those systems is key, right? Because that's going to be your enabler. That's going to enable the OT landscape to do things, I guess, in a more structured approach, have the right firewalls and credentials and all the necessary security measures in place, rather than doing the skunk works type operations and trying to access data through, sideways type architectures, or no architecture at all, and put your 4G router in to bypass those systems. So really, the IT teams need to be on point and being a service to the OT space and enabling it.
Yeah, security is probably my favorite topic to dive into. And the first thing that we always dive into is you can't protect what you can't see. So if you can't see it, you have no chance in protecting it or isolating and protecting the environment from it.
Cisco's to me one of those brands, Kevin, that have been so well, definitely ubiquitous across the IT space, the carpet floor, well known, strong brand. And as we move into OT, and both Phil and I've experienced it, we know there's legacy protocols. There's all these issues happening in that OT space. And Cisco have done a fantastic job in really making that technology, that hardened, like you mentioned, visible solutions happen in the OT space. And I know that you created some wonderful guides around architectures that link OT, IT. You've provided so many resources to industry. I want to say you've solved, but definitely made it technology available, and in your role in helping that. So where you see the roadblocks? What is the roadblocks or the barriers to adopting the technologies or the infrastructure at Cisco? What are the problems or the technical issues you'll see?
From the customer perspective,
Yeah, from the customers, yeah, in industry.
I think number one, they think that security, I should say both sides believe that somebody else is handling security, right? So IT thinks that if OT is going to operate into this environment, that they've got a lens of security, when in fact, OT, not that they don't care about security, but they care about things like OEE and plan uptime, producing goods. So, and let's face it, they're not security experts in that field. And OT has this misconception that, IT is there to, destroy their world in some aspects, right? The technology, because what we're seeing now with the Industry 4 is the paradigm of, and I don't want to use the notion of convergence or replacement. I think it's more of a collaboration between IT and OT, because we have the traditional that you talked about, these enterprise technologies that we've really got solidified over the years. They're starting to proliferate into the OT space. And so our job, I think, is to communicate with the OT folks that What we're really trying to do is to bring best of breed type technology into that space to protect it. And I think we can't just, in order to sell to OT, we can't just talk about security. We have to talk about the benefits of them, and that's uptime. If I have a security breach, guess what? Downtime. So it affects, it hits those KPIs or the things that OT really cares about. So we have to be able to articulate that. So from a security perspective, I think there's one. The other thing is I think that is often overlooked is there's an infinite highway that we can do whatever we want to. We don't have to think about it. And what I mean by that is the infrastructure is often overlooked. So we can buy these beautiful applications. We can roll out these beautiful infrastructures across AI, and we can deploy millions of sensors and thousands of cameras, but we don't always think about what the highway looks like. And chances are in those environments that infrastructure may have not been touched for 10 or 15 years or, maybe even more, right? And as you think about AI, and the proliferation of things like machine vision and cameras and sensors, um, we're starting to talk about the introduction of 10 gig on the plant floor where we haven't thought about that before. I mean, I remember a time when everybody thought gig was way more than enough because manufacturing was small. Yeah, I mean, from a communication perspective, now all of a sudden the introduction of AI computer vision is bringing thousands of cameras on board. They're 4K high definition cameras with, lots of big bandwidth streams. And what happens when a PLC, which is its control systems are very sensitive to latency. If I interject all this video and I can't sufficiently control it or interleave that traffic to allow it to pass, I'm going to affect uptime. I'm going to affect the ability to produce. So I think those are two big, I would say, misconceptions, if you will, that they have about each other, or that we miss in that manufacturing space.
Yeah, the bandwidth is gonna be a huge challenge on the plant floor and, especially with aging, factories, where they've got, dedicate copper kind of infrastructure. They don't maybe not move to that fiber optic networking, systems, Cisco have a broad range of products that support, 10 gig ports, hundreds of ports in a rack, as well. So we're starting to see the scale of this networking infrastructure increase as we start, bringing on those hundreds of thousands of sensors into ecosystems. I guess, you know, it's a real challenge to
I think,
kind of start that
and,
way.
and I think the other thing is we're starting to see now real-time communication needs. Historically, we saw it with PLCs and control, but now we're bringing in AGBs, we're bringing in cobots, we're bringing in other things that have to have lossless communication. And one of the biggest misconceptions too is I can take that technology and drop it on a traditional Wi-Fi network that was built for hand scanners, right? It doesn't work. So on my AGB networks, if I drop packets and I lose timeouts, chances are my entire AGV network will come to a halt and it requires manual intervention to restart. So the notion that I have to have lossless, constant uptime. And think about this too. Our notion of robots in the past have been, think about a large manufacturer where we have a robotic arm that's doing a task. We put a fence around it, right, to protect the human. As we're going into 4 and into 5, the fence is coming down. The notion of putting a human and a robot side by side, what that means is if I can't afford to lose connection or I can't afford to have a data breach, because if I do that, I'm potentially losing life, right? Because somebody's going to get hurt. Um, it's not just about uptime anymore. It's about preservation of life and safety.
And that infrastructure that's required to do that, that sits at the OT layer. w- Do you see that? Because I see a lot, for example, where IT got the beautiful data centers and nice clean rooms, and they're putting beautiful infrastructure. But then you get to that space in the factory, Kevin, where it's maybe not as clean, not as robust. How are they able to, I suppose, maintain that infrastructure, that environment, or do you see it as, are they old? Are they Are they upgrading as often as they should be? What are some of those issues they're facing?
We're I like to think I'd like to think that they are. I would also like to think in those spaces that they're using the appropriate gear. Sometimes it's cheaper, easier to just put a enterprise grade switch on the plant floor. I have seen issues where you get metal filings and electronics sucked in because they got fans, right? So thinking about the infrastructure, the environmentals, and going to a ruggedized platform is going to be important. The right form factor is going to be important. Um, and I would like to think that enterprise, we typically see people 36 to 48 months, they're doing refreshes. There's kind of an ongoing rolling cycle. When we start talking about industrial, we're talking about 7, 10, 12 years before they touch stuff.
Wow.
And the longevity, and it speaks a lot to the, uptime of the gear and the capabilities. But what we start falling behind with is we talked about bandwidth before, be more bandwidth, or I need new functionality on the platform, or I'm starting to creep into meantime failure. So if it's electronics at some point, after 10, 15 years, there's a chance of failure. And these electronic components do have failure mean times, and they'll start creeping out on that. So we start affecting uptime. So it's important for, I think, everybody to understand and realize where they are in that life cycle. And I'd love to see customers who have a plan to say, I'm in constant perpetual refresh. At some point, I'm refreshing something, but I have a long-term map instead of what I would call sweating the assets. And we're getting down to the wire where I've got some vulnerability that can be patched because my platform is no longer supported. And that is a major, major red flag in security. If I can't download a patch and fix it, I just open myself up to a plethora of vulnerabilities.
In that space, Kevin, the what's moving, doing patching and adding infrastructure, it's quite a strong skill set. How do you find the OT people have managed to keep up to date? I'm saying that because I was fortunate enough to do a CCNA like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So to understand the terminology of what's required on plant floor, but how do you see it? Has it got better? Are they fluid OT layers, or managed, unmanaged, and cutting VLANs and all those other things? How do you see it?
So every customer is different, and I would call it their point of demarcation on where does IT stop and OT take over. Some plants or manufacturers will go all the way to the switch. Some stop at distribution, and everything below is OT. What happens when you don't, and this goes back to that communication plan. So if we've got a good communication plan and we communicate standards and how we're going to do things, we educate people appropriately, if we have a consistent infrastructure. If not, you've got a broken infrastructure. You've got a security policy, some security policy on the other side that may or may not communicate. I think, is it getting better? I think that in a way it is, but it's part of that realization that they have to come together. And part of that mission for Industry 4 and 5 is that line's blurred. And when we educate people on what Industry 4 really is, that has to change. Now, keep in mind that I would say, I don't know, probably 60, 70% of our customers are somewhere in 3 dot something, right? So we haven't quite made it to 4. Because remember what 3 was about connecting things, right? When we start talking about 4, we start thinking about how do I do that securely? And how do I bring visibility in? And how do I tell an OT environment that you don't need to air gap that anymore? That air gap network is a bad idea, because a misconception of that air gapped environment is safe, when in all actuality, a USB key or, remote access into by a vendor is all it would take to compromise it. And if you don't have visibility, then you can't see the compromise. If it's not connected, you can't see the compromise. And then when we get into AI, you start thinking about, how do I train my models, right? And there's a big misconception out now that I don't have enough data to train these models. And I would argue that you probably do. The fact of the matter is, you've got all these dark pools of data sitting in your factory floor that aren't connected. And so in the absence of having access to that data, organizations have went out, we'll just use synthetic data. And when we use synthetic data, we get synthetic answers. So the notion of the day of having, everything isolated by air gap, it is gone. And in order to progress in AI, those who want to really catapult and be competitive in that space have to change that viewpoint. If you stay in the whole world of we're going to air gap and stay the way it used to be, you'll get left behind really quick, because we all know how fast this AI world is evolving, and you'll get left behind really, really quick.
Yeah, I guess that's where security in depth comes in, right? Like that network segmentation. Yes, you do have sort of areas in the plant that are dark at this stage, but you're trying to, I guess, get the connectivity portion right in a secure manner, so that data can either be utilizing secure protocols, or bridging that gap between those different layers within your business. Just trying to do that. I guess what are some key steps or things that you know manufacturers or end users can identify to start, I guess, on that journey of network segmentation, visibility, zero trust type architectures? What can they do to move their plant floor forward?
Yeah, so I like to think about it, and I'm going to talk about it as very infrastructure centric, just because that's where I live every day. So I like to think about it in three major chunks. So, what is the largest sensor you have in your environment? And I would argue it's the network, because at every point as you enter, every device touches the network immediately, right, in order to connect. So that needs to be our first point of collection. It's no longer feasible to say, my client can get on the network and then I'm going to have an IPS somewhere upstream and detect it, because I'm already in, right? I'm already doing my thing, right? Or having a firewall with large segments. So we're starting to introduce the notion of micro segmentation down to the port level. So the whole notion of network as a sensor is providing true visibility at the time the device plugs in. There's electrical pulse, the NIC negotiates, and it hops on the wire. And what that really means is the ability to provide an industrial visibility solution. And we offer something called cyber vision, which is embedded in the network. It's inside the switching gear. Um, I don't like to bolt on top, because it makes OT worlds more and more complex, and they're already complex enough for that environment. So if I can embed it in the gear, I don't have to introduce span tap. I don't have to introduce remote span overlays, things that increase latency and overhead on my network, I avoid. So what I'm doing there is I'm building an access. I'm building a database of all my access devices that are on the plant floor. And once I get and those devices start talking, and they start talking to industrial protocols, I start interpreting what they are, who they're talking to, what their normal line of communication is. And oh, by the way, with our threat intelligence built in, I'm going to say, what is their risk score? So immediately, if you just stop there from an OT perspective and think about, I've got this huge amount of information at my fingertips, because now I know exactly what I've got. I know what the risk score is. And I think it's important. Yes, we're doing it from a security perspective, but articulate to the OT space that that risk score is really about your uptime. So we want to get that number as low as possible. Um, and if you don't have that, you cannot do a segmentation strategy, because if you do a segmentation strategy without the visibility information up front, you're taking a shot in the dark, right? And chances are 9 times out of 10, or maybe 99% of the time, it's going to be incorrect. So what we're doing here is real-time visibility, getting that information, building that database, building that list of vulnerabilities, and then trying to take it to the next step. And I'm going to call that as network as the enforcer. So at this point, historically, we've had a lot of manufacturers that have put in a lot of small firewalls here and there and everywhere. But we start talking about manufacturing, that's a lot of overhead and a lot of management, because we're talking hundreds, if not even thousands of firewalls across some of the large super manufacturing floors. So what we're doing is we're taking a look and saying, all right, I've got this database of data. Now what do I do with it? So we integrate it into the network infrastructure And we have an identity solution called ICE. And what we do is we integrate all that data. So our enterprise tools that Ed, I think you talked about earlier, are great for enterprise devices. But when I typically see an OT device, I see a MAC address and an IP address. There's no persona for me to apply security to. But with an OT visibility tool with the proper integration, suddenly that MAC address and IP address turns into a PLC with this version of firmware, this risk score, this list of vulnerabilities, and how do I remediate? So with all that information, I can in turn and apply policy based upon any of those characteristics. So if we walk through this and say that I've plugged into the network, I've been discovered, my machine has been discovered by the visibility tool, immediately shared with my access or my ICE application for control my access, then I can apply policy and grouping right there, then and now. So I can move them to the appropriate access. And the beauty of the visibility tool too is everybody knows a bit about the Purdue model, I think, and the notion of how I build that framework to segment my environment. My OT visibility tool should allow me to visually build my grouping. So whatever's in level 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and up. And that integration, all that grouping moves over. So when I get to my policy application, all I have to do is apply policy. And so what it does is I can take port 1 and port 2 on a switch based on my identity and device, and I can apply microsegmentation to isolate those two to allow them to talk or to not allow them to talk. What it means to me is I don't have to punt it northbound to a firewall. I don't have to let it do an entire, cross an entire segment before I apply security. I can do it immediately. And you can even get as granular to say is that's a new device. I don't know what it is. I'm going to quarantine. So no more of that, sleepless night, not knowing what's happening in the plant network. The notion of dynamic segmentation with that point is real. Now, that is the cornerstone of our zero trust network access policy or zero trust networking policy. The other component of that is remote access. So I've been guilty of this in my career early on because we didn't have any better solutions. But if I needed a vendor to come in to do something, I built a VPN on the firewall and I built rules to allow them in. And it was up to me to go back and clean that up, which it doesn't always happen. So you end up with this security policy with these bunch of latency rules with people have access because we didn't clean it up properly. So what we're introducing here is the notion of a ZTNA solution or zero trust network access, where we actually push our ZTNA gateway all the way down to the switch. So just the ability, just like our visibility tools have the ability to run in the switch, so does that gateway. So when I'm an external vendor, I come through a secure tunnel all the way to the switch, and I define in my application that Ed can get to PLC1, and he can only do that by the RDP application or SSH. And I'm going to give him access from 1 to 2 p.m. When the first second after 2 p.m., connections tore down automatically. And as a user, I have the ability to supervise that connection. If I see something I don't like, I can record the session, but if I see something I don't like, I can immediately kill the session. And I've also got an active recording, so I know exactly who did what on the keyboard at any given time. So I don't have this whole notion of, who did what, what changed, and we're going to look for 8 hours to figure out why the factory's down. So we prevent a lot of that. The other thing the visibility tools provide is change management control. So somebody come and did a stop-start CPU on a PLC or a firmware upgrade. That's going to be a modification change in my visibility tool that should flag to say, you didn't have access to do that, or you did this. I'm going to let people know because the person that violates change control is going to be the last one to raise their hand to say that I did it. And it makes a difference. I mean, I've seen plants be down for days because somebody made a change and nobody know what happened. And they, it's needle in a haystack time, right? And then once we get to that step, the most important step, I think, from a CISO office is the visibility aspect. And when I say visibility, it's the pane of glass, like what's going on between IT and OT. And we made an acquisition of Splunk last year. And that's where we're doing an aggregation of all of our cockpit data. So the CISO office of the CISO, I have a visibility of all my OT space, all my IT space, and I can correlate and transition. So if there is an attack, which inevitably somebody will get over the wall, right? When they do, the notion of is how fast do we detect it? How fast do we isolate it? And how fast can we clean up what happened? It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how we respond. So those are the kind of those pillars to our overall security strategy. And there's a huge amount of conversation that we could go into around each one of those, but that's kind of our recipe, if it will.
Yeah, so that really kind of gives us some insights into how, how the Cisco suite really attacks kind of all those different aspects of cybersecurity, and some of those vulnerabilities that are always kind of not necessarily external threats. Yeah, these come from internal change management processes where they're not always the easiest to follow, or there are tr- people not necessarily following the right steps all the time, and giving you the traceability to be able to recall, what happened, when it happened, and maybe an opportunity to retrain or correct some processes within the business. So that's a really good opportunity to really highlight those challenges.
Yeah. And people don't necessarily do them maliciously. Like I said before, OT's job is to produce, and they will get under the gun to make something happen, and they will just take action because that's their goal is to produce, and not knowing the wake that's left behind them because they did something improper. So
Definitely production. Production is king, as you know, in manufacturing, and anything that once I get in the way, but definitely that's the by now. So, Kevin, in your years of experience visiting many, many sites, talking and seeing where businesses are at, when you walk onto a site, what are the 2 or 3 key things you're looking for to know how mature or immature that company is in being, let's say, what you described before would be best in class? You mentioned about ZTNA and all these infrastructure processes that are available today. But what are the 2 or 3 things or questions you might ask to know straight away where are these people in their maturity or immaturity in networking?
if I can, I like to have OT and IT at the same table when I'm there or walking the floor. First thing I'm going to ask is about security, and I'm going to see how easily that flows off the tongue, right? Usually it's not. It's pretty, you know, there's a misconception on both sides, but I want to hear each side's take on how they do security. The other thing that's interesting is what is the perception of cloud? What do they think it is? How do they use it? Why are they afraid of it? Or not? And I would say the other thing is really the perception of what they're going to do with AI because it's here now. Um, and sometimes we'll just ask basic questions about people policy between IT and OT. If you want something done on the OT space, how do you go about requesting it? And we get everything from a formal process to, well, I really don't, I just do it. Right. Or, and quite honestly, I've seen some knockdown drag out conversations between OT and IT. Some of the times you just want to step out of the room and just let it, they're going to have to get over it, get through it. But, I think our goal is, I always joke because, our logo is the bridge. I think in an OT space and my team, we talk to OT primarily. So our goal is to kind of be the bridge to help educate on what we're doing with technology. It's not the big scary thing, and how we bring it to bear. But we are a bit of the bridge and the psychologist when we get into some of these environments. But from a maturity perspective, it's security, because that tells me immediately is what the process is, and it also tells me how quick you're able to adopt new technologies. So if I've got a secure dynamic infrastructure, can I retool an assembly line in days instead of weeks or months? So what does that mean to time to market? So it starts painting a picture on how efficient the operations is running. Um, and I will even try to get some personal things about what are your security events, and a lot of that's under NDA always, but what are some of these security events that you've experienced? Because it's going to start telling me, Sometimes you have executives that are a little bit brave on their comments to say, I know exactly what's in my environment. I'm fully protected. I'm all good. And we've had those, we've come along and put visibility tools. And then they had that eye opening moment where there was servers on desks on the plant floor under a desk that hasn't been patched in 10 years. And it had, 15 or 20 vulnerabilities. Oh, and it had a modem or an internet access point behind it. And they were just floored. Right. So I think the red flag for me is when somebody says I'm secure. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you've got in place or what practices. You can never fool yourself to say I'm secure, and that would really flag me to dig in when somebody says that.
It seems like everyone's a bit when it comes to security, everyone wants to, tout that they're Fort Knox, right? But the truth is most, I guess, businesses have had events to some degree. Some use, to the point of ransomware where they're, lost all their data or had to pay a particular, you know, try and get their data back or, you know, those types of events because they do happen and like no one's going to brag about that, but that seems to be a huge catalyst for making your system secure.
And interesting thing now in the world of AI and robotics and cobots is I don't have to take data. I just have to get access to your data to change the data set because I can change the entire operation of how your facility works by changing the data set that AI is going to actually learn from. So there's a whole new wave of attacks that's just focusing on coming in and tweaking some data and leaving, right? Just to wreak havoc. It's I think it's more of a retaliatory type attack, probably on more of an armed. I'm not stealing anything. I'm just going to cause you great pain. So
Yeah. I saw an article just this week around some external threats, but they're really targeting that remote connectivity portion because, we've distributed work from home workforces now. You, your security has to be really tight. VPN access, remote desktops, solutions, really managed from a wide area network perspective, as
think
well.
about our perimeter before it was always within four walls. Now post COVID, like you said, and then with the IoT advent, with all the sensors and other things that are added, does our boundary just exploded? And I almost would say there is no boundary. Now we just have to be able to protect the endpoints, protect the clients, protect all of our connections. Security is more of a difficult job than it's ever been across the board.
A lot of our customers that Phil and I deal with, Kevin, are quite, and mate, I know Australia's on the line here, but globally dealing with modern technology and legacy technology, like legacy protocols that probably don't have the security built into them. What's your take? What do customers do with those sort of scenarios where there's just nothing they can do with that protocol or that product? What's your suggestions?
So, yeah, this is called the compensating controls. When I can't fix it, but I still have to have it. So historically, what we've talked about was putting ruggedized firewalls close to isolate. They're still connected, but I really control what comes in and out, right? Um, the first inclination to those for people is to pull the network connection and just let them sit out there and do their thing or isolate them on a segment, which we talked about before is not the right answer either. But I'm going to go back to say, um, I'm confident in our security strategy and the fact that our security visibility story for industrial is an industrial IPS IDS as well. But I'm also delivering microsegmentation. So if that device is at a risk of being compromised, I start pushing policies down to that port level on that switch to say that this device can talk to this device only using these protocols. So I can start getting granular as to what I'm allowing. But this is why micro segmentation is important in that strategy. Otherwise, I'll always have to put firewalls to contain and provide some sort of control plane, because there's, like you said, a manufacturing organization is often, especially legacy and older manufacturer, is like a Smithsonian of operating systems. It's got anything and everything that you could possibly think of, and probably any and every vulnerability on some of those old ones that can't be fixed. So it's all about compensating controls. And um, I'm really bullish on our security strategy at a micro level, so I can actually get very granular on what I'm going to allow.
And in that space, Kevin, I think about the skill set required by the OT people to think about your microsegmentation and trust security, and all these other things you mentioned. What is a good way for them to maintain and stay up to date? Because it's a lot to learn, lot to absorb. You're a specialist in your field, obviously. How do they do it?
So this is letting go and trust. This is where this comes in. And this is about them leveraging IT as a resource to help execute. Because yes, these tools are more complicated. They do require more of a network knowledge, if you will. So I would say this is where we have to start educating. And this is the tough part. This is the people part. This is the process part where people have to let go. Because this is the part where we're starting to talk about this gray area with communication and collaboration between IT and OT. And it's got to happen in order to make that, to cross that chasm. Because we can't expect, nothing against industrial engineers, but we can't expect an industrial engineer who's working on robots and making sure that plant operations is good to be up to enforcement policies and access control policies and IT security. It's just inevitably not going to happen. If we try to make them, an jack of all trades, then they're not going to be an expert in either one. And we need them to be an expert in manufacturing. We need IT to be an expert, but we have to convince them that it's okay to trust each other. Everybody's got the common interest involved. And we have to actually change that demarcation and we have to allow IT down to the access port.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's actually a conversation I had today with a systems engineer saying, we know very specific tasks within the automation space. We don't necessarily have all the skill sets to be then managing enterprise architecture as well. So, their main priorities are plant floor operations, keeping uptime, resiliency, building, secure plant floor operations, not necessarily looking after the whole enterprise and having multiple access points, firewall rules. It's not their responsibility at that level. So they have to be brought in to the table, of course, to give their requirements for the OT network and space, but the administrative tasks of those fall totally into the IT domain as well, especially as we're moving towards integrated, federated identity management throughout that enterprise as well.
Yeah, 100%.
In that space, I suppose, what are you seeing moving forward to make, I won't say life easier, but I'll say life easier for those who are not fluent as the IT people are? Are you seeing more tools? Are you seeing the likes of, ChatGPT, all these tools to make the questions that the OT people easier to I suppose answer? I know trusting IT is a good part. I know you mentioned that, but they just absolutely need to. What do you think coming forward to make that life even easier? Well, Cisco are way ahead in this space, right?
Yeah. So the concepts there is, we talked a little bit of ChatGPT or AI. So how do I embed AI into our management tools where the operator can say, hey, PLC one is not working, and start doing some immediate troubleshooting. Okay, we're going to ping PLC one, can't ping. We're going to start doing all the way down to layer 2 type connectivity. And what it does is it arms the OT operator when they go back to IT to say, here's what I found, right? Here's the last time it was up. I can ping it, but for some odd reason, it's not communicating. It starts narrowing down and increasing our troubleshooting time. And then I think there's a big push and a lot of asks. We see it every day to provide a simplified cockpit for the OT space. Give me what I need to see. Don't overwhelm me with, massive amounts of technical data that I don't understand. But how do I present that to you? But I think the conversational AI is going to be big to say, all right, here's what I see. This is not working. This is not working, or this is happening, and let AI start generating basically a report to say, IT, I've did some troubleshooting here. Here's what I've come up with based on AI. But that takes, in my opinion, hours out of the troubleshooting cycle by getting some of that stuff removed. And we have the capability to do that. Things inside Catalyst Center from our management tools, and we've got some AI management tools that are being embedded in things like Cybervision and others that will be able to allow you to ask those questions to say, based on my normal uptime, based upon my normal communications, what's happening now, and can run that intelligence in those NLMs to actually be able to articulate some of that information back to IT.
And could I use it potentially to make a quick connection, like you mentioned, that third-party access? Because like today, manufacturers struggling with having internal resources enough, and they'll be able to say to the network, "Hey, I need you to allow this integrator to connect for the next 3 hours." And
You could. What we've done also with our ZTNA, we call it our trust broker in the cloud, is it's a really easy to use interface that you can enable the OT to have to say, all right, I need this user in the system to have access to this resource. And they're required to pick a protocol to say, okay, they're going to use SSH or something. And I'm going to say, here's the time of day and submit. And then the third party will get a note to say you've been granted access. Click here. It's basically that rudimentary. They click here, the connection's brought up. Now, even if it's a more granular to say that your PLC vendor has some software on a laptop that they need to get access to, we have something called Secure Equipment Access Plus, which is an agent base that they can put on their laptop to actually allow that client to talk. But Secure Equipment Access is a game changer. It is built with OT in mind. So there's always a web portal. You can give access to somebody operator that can, without going to IT, that they can self-serve, if you will, and give access as they see fit.
Yeah, that sounds like a really smart solution to that remote access portion. We know there's quite a few vendors that are looking at that as, you know, almost embedded into their, hardware,
Yep.
as well, these days. And so, just having the automatic closure of of that access point is a kind of a bit of a game changer. And we all know the story of, leaving password credentials still active from, previous employees, and the maintenance of that, going forward. So if we can reduce the amount of effort that it takes to maintain these networks, it's going to be, really valuable.
And I would say, if at all possible, when you have these abilities, technologies to embed them into the infrastructure, do it. I often cringe when I go in and see people building parallel networks just for spanning and tapping and collecting data. So, how if you take a 1 million square foot plant, and how expensive cabling would be to cable every device, think about multiplying that by 2, and multiplying that across the board and building that tap infrastructure. So I always cringe a bit, and often I get a call to say, help me get out of what the journey I've taken, because operationally long term, the more we bolt on, the more difficult, the more expensive it is to maintain.
You mentioned before air gapping. Please don't do air gapping. What are other some misunderstandings you see in industry around networking, IT infrastructure, enterprise side wise?
So I think, we mentioned a little bit before, and misconception is that everything is natively secure. And I'm going to say, just because you buy an application or you buy a connection and they tell you it's secure, don't trust that, right? Take security into your own hands. The other misconception is a lot of manufacturers are looking to the cloud for data. The other misconception would be that cloud security and on-premise security are the same, because they're not. Misconception that the Purdue model is dead because we're now looking at cloud. It's not. I say the Purdue model just got another layer, right? And that layer is called cloud. So I think the Purdue model was not meant to be followed by the letter of the law. It is a framework to help you visualize and segment your environment. Um, and as we talked about security, a misconception is security is always somebody else's problem. And then I have indefinite bandwidth to deal with that I don't need just because I'm going to install 1,200 cameras. And what we'll see with OT is they'll order 1,200 cameras and then they'll come to IT, or they're worse yet, they'll plug them in, right? And say, my stuff's not working. So misconception there is that there's an unlimited amount of bandwidth and an unlimited infrastructure to do whatever you want. That takes some planning and some thought. So I would say that those are probably some of the biggest ones we see, along with collaboration, that we're against each other, right? That OT and IT are against each other, when it's not the realization at all. They just don't understand each other.
Yeah. And I guess what, in your opinion, what's the future look like from a networking and security point of view? What does that look like in your, I guess, crystal ball?
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty exciting spot, and it's all driven around AI and how we build an AI ready infrastructure. How do we secure that? And we have to continue to push security, as we talked about before, with the way robotics and cobotics are coming into play. The way that have to provide zero lossless type connectivity. And I'm the one that you can't go pick a wireless technology and say it's my silver bullet, right? I can't just say 5G is it or whatever. So I adopt what we call a multi-access wireless strategy. And it's basically that there's room for all to play. I need 802.11 for my client access. I still need it, right? So I'm going to have tablets and mobile devices. I probably have some good use cases for 5G, and I probably have some good use cases for technology that we have called ultra reliable wireless backhaul, which is a zero lossless wireless that can roam at 250 miles an hour. So it's a make before you break type connectivity. The biggest misconception on the wireless front is that I'm going to pick one. It's going to be, because of hype or whatever, it's going to fix all my problems. If you do not look at a use case up front for wireless and define what your use cases are, you will miss, because there's not one that fits every use case. So my perception is that we can have room for all of this to play. And I think the biggest driver, as I'll go back to AI again, but the biggest driver for a lot of things that are occurring right now: wireless communication, segmentation, security, bandwidth, things like precision timing protocols that provide time to those various components of the network, as well as things like interleaving traffic to say that, yeah, I know I've got 1,000 video streams going, but I've got to get this PLC communication through before it times out. So I'm going to hit the pause on those video streams, interject that PLC traffic, let it go, and then restart. So there's technologies like that have to be put into play. But AI is really what's next and what's driving us. And I don't think it really changed our focus on anything. It just accelerated everything that we were doing before. That we have to do it faster, we have to do it better.
So that means more data, more bandwidth, more devices.
Yep.
Is that what you say?
Yep. More data, more bandwidth, more devices. And in the past, where we said, we don't need all that bandwidth for uplinks and various things, I don't think there's a limit at this point. So it's kind of, because we're starting to talk about edge compute. I have a perception that we made this massive correction. Everything's got to be the cloud. And now there's kind of a little bit of a course correction to say a hybrid model is what we need. Because I need to pull data stacks and workloads, especially with AI, that I can have AI workloads on my plant floor. Because there's some things that I need to respond to a lot quicker than I can trombone it up and out of the cloud. All that's adding data. Manufacturers have small data centers, edge compute on the floor. So it will explode the amount of data that we're going to have. If it's already exploding, but it's just going to incrementally accelerate the amount of data that's coming out of the plant.
So what's happening to hardware switches in this case then? Are they getting more data? Are they getting AI built in them? What are you seeing in that switch in the hardware?
Yep, we're releasing a new generation of industrial switches now that are AI ready. So more compute power. So the notion of being able to run microservices on the switch itself, like we run our visibility sensors or ZTNA, but you can also run third-party micro applications on this. And we've had some partners who have taken our switches and running a small NLM to run a robotic arm, completely isolated. It was very specifically task oriented, but the notion of think of every network device that I have, and I have a little bit of compute that I can actually leverage. Um, the silicon is changing. Commodity silicon is not where it's at. We're building new levels of silicon to do stuff in hardware and do it faster. So I don't want everybody to think a switch is a switch is a switch is a switch, because it's not true. When we start connecting, we want to have industrial protocol intelligence built in. We want to have the ability to control traffic at a detail level. We want to have high speed throughput. I suddenly have to have PoE density on the plant floor for cameras and other things and wireless access points. So our biggest portfolio family is our industrial switching environment. That's what we've been known for a long time. Um, Although our portfolio has expanded a lot to industrial gateways and security products and wireless, but that core foundation of where I plug in is really where we've invested a lot of technology and continue to do that with the announcement back at Cisco Live with the IE 3500, which is our most advanced AI ready infrastructure switch.
It as we I imagine, Kevin, with all your learning, you must be right on top of things. So what is Kevin going to be learning over the next 12 months? What are you trying to dig yourself into and learn more about?
Well, I'm always focused on security and how to do it better. I feel like you can never stop learning there. But understanding more about how we can do AI and ML, machine learning, and the impact there. Um, and also, how do we secure cloud workloads? Those are all big, because the other thing is the notion of we're into this kind of neck deep right now, but how do I take a physical PLC and virtualize it? Right. So people are taking PLCs off the plant floor and they're virtualizing it. It's one thing to do it on the shop floor or in the local manufacturing data center. But what if I send that PLC a few miles down the road? Then I have to be able to put an overlay over top the network to let them think that they're layer 2 adjacent when they're actually miles apart. So there's a lot of things like that there. And, we're starting to look at virtual clients on the plant floor. All that has its own impact on communication and L2 adjacencies and those type of things. But those are all I guess the revolutionary things that we're trying to look at to kind of help pave that way to that next gen manufacturing. But I think the one that's probably on the edge the most outside of AI is probably the notion of virtualizing that PLC infrastructure on the plant floor.
Yeah, it's definitely something that people are starting to look at. Everyone's kind of looking at those, I guess, containerized type solutions.
Yep.
Distributing the compute, um, you know, to traditional OS systems and containerized systems, Linux types boxes. Distributing all that network traffic, and yeah, you'll definitely have to start moving that data really quickly, to see that kind of come to fruition, as well. Look, Kevin, it's been an incredible conversation. We've traveled really, from plant floor all the way up to cloud, talking about network security. So really appreciate your time today and coming on the Unplugged and IoT podcast. I guess, have you got any final thoughts or, I guess, pearls of wisdom for our audience, as we close out?
I would probably, I know I'm gonna sound like I'm saying the same thing over here, but visibility, 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 because we can't do anything without making sure that you figured that out. If you don't have a visibility tool in place, don't be lulled into the false sense of security that you know what you have, because you don't. And then you can't be too secure. Security is not meeting a compliance standard. That's the minimum ticket to the dance, right? But we have to do more to secure our environment. And I'm constantly doing things on LinkedIn and other, snippets as I think of things that are important to share. So if others want to, feel free to look me up and follow, reach out, ping me, ask questions. I'm here and happy to help.
No, that's great, Kevin. I just up to everyone there, please reach out to Kevin on LinkedIn and all those media places. I'm sure will be links at the bottom of this podcast too. But something, Phil, that Kevin mentioned about virtualizing PLCs, the issue is PLCs haven't evolved, but the PLCnext is an evolution of PLCs. The PLCnext is that industry for PLC that just provides that extra layer beyond what normal PLCs do, allow it to be able to put apps inside the PLCnext to store and plug into a global and digital ecosystem that's scalable, that's connectable, that moves at the enterprise-wide feel. So we are very happy that this podcast was powered by PLCnext. It's a very exciting platform, and we're very grateful to Kevin for the insights he's given us around the enterprise, around networking. I highly encourage everyone to listen again to this podcast. There's a lot of meat here today, Phil. Lots of information that I really have to dig through it more and more. So, Kevin, thanks very much for your time today. Really grateful for it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And for everyone listening, don't forget to subscribe to Unplugged and IoT podcast for more episodes with industry leaders and innovators such as Kevin. And thanks for tuning in.